Your kitchen cabinet is a crime scene. That dusty jar of black pepper next to your stove was once worth more than its weight in gold. Men died for it. Entire civilizations burned to the ground just so an emperor could season his dinner. Today, we sprinkle nutmeg on a latte without a second thought. 500 years ago, a handful of that same spice could buy you a permanent estate in London, complete with servants and a ship. We think of world history as a story of kings, religions, and grand political ideas. The truth is much bloodier. Human civilization was forged by a desperate, violent hunt for plants. The modern world exists because Europe had bland food, and they were willing to kill anyone who stood between them and a better-tasting meal. For centuries, Western Europe was geographically isolated. Their diet was a monotonous cycle of salted meats, root vegetables, and stale bread. Food wasn't a pleasure. It was a matter of survival, and it tasted like it. Meanwhile, a completely different world thrived in the East. India, the Moluccas, and the islands of modern-day Indonesia possessed a biological monopoly. They grew things the West could only dream of: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, nutmeg. These plants required a very specific tropical climate, volcanic soil, and torrential rainfall. They could not grow in the cold, rocky terrain of Europe. If you wanted flavor, you had to pay for it, and the price was astronomical. Getting these spices to Europe was a logistical nightmare. A single peppercorn traveled thousands of miles before it reached a Roman noble's plate. It changed hands dozens of times. First, local harvesters in India gathered the green berries. Then Arab traders packed them onto wooden dhows, navigating the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean. Next, the cargo moved to camel caravans, trekking across burning deserts, enduring sandstorms, and dodging bandits along the Silk Road. By the time the spice reached Constantinople or Alexandria, Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa bought it at a massive markup. They shipped it across the Mediterranean and sold it to European elites. Every single person along that chain took a cut. Every middleman added a tax. By the time a bag of cinnamon reached a wealthy family in Paris, the price had inflated by an astonishing 5,000%. Spices became the ultimate status symbol. Pliny the Elder, a famous Roman writer, openly complained about this economic drain. He calculated that Rome lost over 50 million sesterces every single year to India just to buy luxury goods. That is the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars today, completely vanishing from the Roman treasury just for culinary vanity. If you served heavily spiced meat at a banquet, you weren't just showing off your chef. You were flashing your bank account. You were telling your guests that you could afford to consume literal currency. If discovering how everyday ingredients altered world history is blowing your mind, hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden forces that shaped our world. Then, the world changed overnight. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. The traditional overland trade routes were slammed shut. The Christian nations of Europe suddenly found themselves cut off from the East. The Venetian merchants who held a monopoly on Mediterranean trade jacked up their prices even higher. Spain and Portugal were backed into a corner. They were broke, desperate, and craving the wealth of the spice trade. They realized they had only one choice. If they couldn't go through the Middle East, they had to go around it. They had to find a direct sea route to India. This single realization triggered the Age of Discovery. It wasn't an era born out of pure scientific curiosity or a noble desire to map the globe. It was a corporate race fueled by raw, unadulterated greed. Portugal struck first. In 1497, Vasco da Gama sailed south from Lisbon. He bypassed the entire African continent, braving violent storms and unknown waters that had swallowed countless ships before him. When he finally dropped anchor in Calicut, India, the local rulers asked him what he wanted. His answer was simple. He wanted Christians and spices. Da Gama's voyage was a brutal success. He returned to Lisbon with a cargo of cinnamon and pepper. Even after losing half his crew to scurvy and starvation, the profit margin on that single voyage was an unbelievable 6,000%. The Portuguese didn't want to cooperate with local traders. They wanted absolute control. They arrived in the Indian Ocean with heavily armed warships, cannonading ports, sinking merchant ships and slaughtering anyone who challenged their new monopoly. Spain watched Portugal's skyrocketing wealth with absolute panic. They needed their own route. An Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus approached the Spanish crown with a radical, borderline insane idea. He argued that instead of sailing around Africa, he could sail west across the Atlantic Ocean and hit Asia from the back. We all know what happened next. Columbus miscalculated the circumference of the Earth by thousands of miles. He bumped into the Americas entirely by accident, genuinely believing until his dying day that he had reached the spice-rich islands of the East Indies. He didn't find the pepper he was looking for, but his mistake permanently connected two halves of the planet. The global map was redrawn because a man got lost looking for a shortcut to a spice market. As the 16th century progressed, the stakes grew even higher. The ultimate prize on Earth was a tiny, remote cluster of volcanic islands in Indonesia, known as the Maluku Islands, or the Spice Islands. This was the only place on the planet where nutmeg and cloves grew. Nutmeg was the silicon microchip of the Renaissance. It was incredibly rare, wildly expensive, and physicians claimed it was the only cure for the Black Plague, which was regularly wiping out European cities. People carried small nutmeg graters made of silver as a sign of immense wealth. The fight for these islands was vicious. By the early 1600s, a new player entered the game, the Dutch. They created a brand new type of business entity to handle the violence required for global trade. It was called the United East India Company, or the VOC. The VOC was the world's first multinational megacorporation. It was also the first company to be publicly traded on a stock exchange. But it didn't just sell shares. The Dutch government granted the VOC the power to declare wars, build fortresses, mint its own money, and execute people. It was a corporation with its own private army. The VOC arrived in the Spice Islands with a single mission: total monopoly. The Governor-General of the company, a ruthless man named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, decided that the local population of the Banda Islands was cooperating too much with English traders. Cohen's response was horrific. In 1621, VOC forces systematically eradicated the indigenous Bandanese people. They slaughtered, starved, and enslaved nearly 15,000 locals, completely wiping out the island's population. They replaced them with Dutch overseers and slave labor to ensure that every single nutmeg went directly to the Netherlands. The Dutch took their monopoly so seriously that they rubbed their harvested nutmeg in lime before export. This chemical process sterilized the seed, ensuring that no one could buy a Dutch nutmeg and plant it elsewhere to start a competing farm. If you were caught smuggling a live nutmeg tree out of the islands, the punishment was immediate death. The British were also desperate for a piece of the action. They managed to capture a tiny isolated Banda island called Run, which gave them a small foothold in the nutmeg trade. The Dutch besieged the island, leading to a brutal, bloody stalemate that lasted for years. Eventually, the two superpowers realized the fighting was costing too much money. In 1667, they sat down to sign the Treaty of Breda. The terms of this peace deal seemed completely absurd by modern standards. The British agreed to give up their claim to the tiny, nutmeg-rich island of Run. In exchange, the Dutch traded away a seemingly useless, swampy island on the other side of the world that they had captured from the British. That swampy island was Manhattan. The Dutch walked away from that meeting celebrating. They believed they had completely swindled the British, trading away a random piece of North American wilderness for total control over the most valuable spice on Earth. History, of course, had other plans. Monopolies, no matter how violently enforced, never last forever. The system eventually cracked. In the late 18th century, a French missionary and horticulturist named Pierre Poivre successfully smuggled nutmeg and clove plants out of the Spice Islands under the cover of night. He brought them to French colonies in Mauritius and the Seychelles. The secret was out. The biological monopoly was shattered. Soon, these plants were being grown in tropical climates all over the world, from the Caribbean to Africa. Supplies surged, prices plummeted. What was once a luxury reserved for kings became a commodity that ordinary working-class families could afford. The spice trade eventually faded from the headlines of global politics, replaced by oil, gold, and technology. But the scars of that era never truly healed. The lines drawn on our modern maps, the languages spoken across the Americas and Asia, and the wealth distribution of the modern world were all determined by this frantic botanical gold rush. The next time you reach into your pantry and grab a jar of cinnamon or black pepper, take a closer look at it. You are holding the substance that launched 1,000 ships, bankrupted empires, and permanently united the globe in a wave of blood, greed, and flavor.